the momentum was actually solidified when the external affairs minister stated that you could definitely rely on India, to stand by you.
Welcome to the Gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very, very special guest today is Professor Don McLain Gill, a Philippines-based geopolitical analyst, author, and lecturer at the Department of the International Studies, de La Salle University in Manila. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Gill. And it's a real pleasure to
Thank you
have you,
very
and I
much.
appreciate the fact that you joined us at such short notice.
No, it's always a true honor to be part of Strat News Global's program. So it's a great honor for me.
I'm glad to hear that. So let's quickly start this whole thing going, because I suspect you already know why I wanted you to come and talk to us today. I wanted to begin by asking that of late we are noticing a lot of pushback from Manila vis-a-vis China. I'm particularly curious to know, where is this sort of the confidence coming from? Because I don't see too many other nations in the neighborhood pushing back the way the Philippines is. So is it only because the Americans have said something that will support you, or is it something else?
Well, I think that it is not just because of our external support, but it's more of the agency that we are now uncovering, that we are seeking to leverage. And the Philippines, as an Indo-Pacific middle power, under the administration of President Marcos Jr., has indicated its intent to play a more proactive role in the region as a responsible stakeholder in the region. So, as we know, at the heart of President Marcos Jr.'s foreign policy lies the security of Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights based on international law. Now, if you understand it, since the 90s, there have been significant inconsistencies in Philippine foreign policy decisions, the loopholes in our alliance dynamics, our inability to maximize the strategic importance of our country within the geopolitical context. And that has emboldened China throughout the years, which has been quite consistent in its desire for expansion and unilateralism, particularly in the West Philippine Sea. So today, not only is our government addressing these issues pragmatically, but our ally and our partners have also recognized the importance of the need to play a more proactive role in today's region. Right. So this is, of course, very important. And what President Marcos Jr. continues to emphasize on is that this should be the benchmark for what the Philippines must continue to prioritize in the long term. And I think this is very much important.
You said allies and partner. I mean, are you speaking about other countries in the neighborhood, or are you talking about the US?
Well, we only have one treaty ally in terms of understanding our partnership dynamics. We only have one treaty ally, but we have various partners, both traditional and non-traditional. So, in terms of that, we have Japan, great cooperation going on with Japan, Australia, non-traditional partners such as India. The Philippine-India Security Partnership continues to reach new heights, especially with the visit of Dr. Jaishankar, Minister of External Affairs, which has cemented, the growing momentum behind the bilateral partnership. So this is, of course, a lot of things that continuously unfolds, and this is because the Philippines is more willing to play a more proactive role in leveraging its position in the world map.
Okay, I mean, in that sense, but I'll come back to the India part of it later. But there was also some talk about the former President Duterte having some kind of a secret deal with Xi. What is that all about?
Well, these are the speculations that have been going around recently, especially with one of his former officials sort of indicated this in one of his interviews. And up to this day, of course, these these talks are ongoing. The investigation is ongoing. But I believe that when President Marcos Jr. was asked about this, he was appalled, and he said that this is a clear violation of what the Philippines' national interest is all about. But of course, that's one side to it. But what we can see now is that under the current administration, there is a steadfast desire to cement the security of the West Philippine Sea based on international law to take center stage in Philippine foreign policy. And I think this is where we must continue, where the Philippines must continue its decision-making calculations. And I think that's the challenge, because as I've mentioned earlier, since the 90s, we have had various foreign policy decisions and fluctuations at that towards the maritime domain. It was only in 2010 when the Philippines began to slowly prioritize maritime security over internal defense. And that is something that we need to focus on, especially in the years to come, as the situation becomes more complex.
Uh-huh. But in the South China Sea, apart from the sort of geographical differences that you have over territorial issues, what are the other issues that you have with China?
Well, in terms of the greater South China Sea, we have what we call the West Philippine Sea, which encompasses our lawful exclusive economic zone. And this was largely cemented by the 2016 arbitral ruling, which has nullified China's expansive interests. But of course, it's not just the maritime territory per se. As you rightfully mentioned, it's not just the geography, but also the resources there that we are entitled to exploit, and that is within international law in terms of the exclusive economic zone that we have. Unfortunately, China's unilateralism and its desire to project more power at the expense of Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights prohibits the Filipino fishermen to really maximize what they can within our lawful waters. And that's another issue that deals with the socio-economic cost. But if we look at it from a grander scale, China's activities since the 90s within Philippine EEZ also creates problems when it comes to global commerce. Maritime trade is continuously, is continuously at the forefront of international development and geopolitics. And of course, with the vital sea lines of communication within these waters, China's activities continue to provoke that. And of course, keeping it free, open, and inclusive and rules-based. So these are all the challenges that we are facing with what's taking place in the region.
Let's talk about Taiwan. People are worried about whether or not Taiwan will get sort of invaded soon, or whether it's something that China is going to wait about for a long time. How does that impact sort of the Philippines' policy vis-a-vis China? Let's assume that if tomorrow Beijing were to invade Taiwan, what would be the Philippines' position on that? It would impact the Philippines in a big way because it's right in the middle, right?
Absolutely. And, we have to understand in such a scenario, let's say in such a scenario, the situation, the security dynamics in Taiwan is largely intertwined with the security interests of the Philippines, not just because of our alliance with the United States. And if the United States gets involved, well, obviously we would have to be involved as well. But also, in terms of our overseas Filipino workers, over 200,000 OFWs reside in Taiwan. And of course, the geography of Taiwan is very close to the northern point of the Philippine archipelago. And of course, this is something that the EDCA with the United States seeks to address, and that is to prepare Philippines in terms of such scenarios. If such a scenario does break out, we would have to ensure that our defenses, our critical infrastructure are all in place to address such an issue. But of course, we have to understand that China is also wary of its military capabilities. Yes, it has the largest navy in terms of quantitative analysis, but of course, as we all know, China's military is not battle experienced. The last war that it fought was in the 1970s, and he even lost that. So, of course, China is also well aware of its military limitations. It may have far-seas credibility, may have far seas capabilities. But of course, we have to understand that Chinese power projection in terms of its navy is highly restrained within the Western Pacific. It is even largely challenged in the Indian Ocean region. So in this regard, we can see that China is also careful as not to preempt any shooting war because of the logistical nightmares that it would have for Beijing. But at the same time, what we could see is that we could see an increase in provocations. We may at certain points look at the possibility of China taking over some distant islands of Taiwan that are closer to the mainland. So these are the things that we may see.
I see. Let's talk about the tripartite meeting in the U.S. What are your first takeaways from that?
Well, I think the trilateral summit that took place in Washington, of course, represents the growing concerns towards the continuous exacerbation of security conditions in the Indo-Pacific. And that has catalyzed the response from three Indo-Pacific democracies to take a larger role in ensuring that the established order remains intact. Right. So we have seen that there have been particular statements in the vision statement on keeping the South China Sea free, open, and rules-based, the adherence to UNCLOS, the 2016 arbitral ruling, and an increase in trilateral maritime activities, which is crucial. And of course, bearing in mind how collective resilience is crucial for the success of the trilateral, the summit also witnessed several important breakthroughs, that aim to enhance the Philippines' security and economic capabilities. So there was a bipartisan bill, for example, that was introduced in Congress that encompasses 2.5 billion to support and boost the Philippines' defense. And of course, the launching of the Luzon Economic Corridor, the first of its kind in the Indo-Pacific under the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, will provide coordinated investments in high-impact infrastructure projects, right? So these are very important in order to deal with the multidimensional challenges that such countries as the Philippines faces. You don't have to just focus on the defense aspect, but also the economic aspect. However, what matters most now is continuity. And that is, I think, the largest challenge, given the elections coming up in the U.S. And, of course, the changes that have been taking place in Philippine foreign policy since the beginning of time. There are, of course, dangers to its, to it being impeded due to the lack of consent in terms of national political systems. But hopefully, we will ensure that this will be continuous in the long run. It would be crucial not just for all three countries, but for the rest of the region.
Uh-huh. But yet almost every day one keeps hearing about skirmishes on the seas between the Chinese and the Philippines coast guards. What are the chances of that escalating, into spiraling into something that could get worse? Number one, and number two, uh, what exactly do the Chinese want when they are pushing you this far? What exactly are the Chinese looking for? Is it just intimidation, or is it something else that they're trying to push?
Well, first of all, for your second question, I think we have to understand what China's motive is. China's motive from the get-go was to, of course, alter the status quo, the balance of power and the geography to its favor without the overt use of military force. And, this is likened to what the Chinese General Zhang accorded as the cabbage strategy, which entails taking time, to slowly wear down the victim and eventually making the victim accept the new realities, even though it is against that victim's national interest. And we have been seeing this throughout time. And what we're seeing now is that China is trying to cement a new norm of engagement in Philippine waters, and that is through expansive water cannoning. And we've seen the incidents
Mhm.
exacerbate as we are going further. But of course, China tries to make sure that it stops short of war. And what the political will of Manila, and realizing that Manila's reinvigorated political will is against the expansionist interests of Beijing. So of course, that's one goal. The second goal is to tarnish the credibility of the U.S. alliance in the Western Pacific, to show that it's not worth anything because we can do what we want and we can get a free run. And this is, of course, China's ability to exploit the wordings of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines, Article 4, which talks about the U.S. coming to the
I see.
Philippines aid at a time of
Also,
an armed attack. So these are the things that China continues to exploit. And what we believe, yeah.
You know, also, you mentioned, Japan, US, Australia, India, and all these countries. What about the other countries in your immediate Southeast Asian neighborhood? What kind of a reaction are you getting from them? Are you sort of, has anybody told you to take it easy, or
Well,
are people saying, yes, it's a great thing, we'll follow you, or how does that work?
Well, it's likely that Southeast Asian countries will try to remain out of this particular dynamics as much as possible because, given their own individual sensitivities and their varying threat perceptions, and I think Manila is quite clear, and that it quite well, understands that the situation that we're dealing with now is something that our immediate neighbors in Southeast Asia are concerned with, and that is because they are also quite wary of the greater involvement of extra-regional powers in Southeast Asia, which has always been a historic sensitivity for many Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia or even Malaysia. But of course, the Philippines has communicated its position with its neighbors and ensuring that what we are doing is that we are merely defending what is rightfully ours based on international law, and we are not provoking the status quo because what we are trying to do is we're trying to save whatever is left of it. Right. However, Southeast Asian states, given their varied threat perceptions, look at it from different lenses. And of course, we recognize that we cannot please all our neighbors, but what we're doing is that we're continuously communicating with them, orienting them, socializing them towards what's actually taking place on the ground and the stakes involved, right? And this is something that Manila takes well into its consideration, and it tries to show that what we're doing is to ensure that our people are able to maximize their livelihood within our exclusive economic zone, focusing on other areas of socio-economic growth and development. So this is how the Philippines tries to balance it, with its immediate neighbors.
Uh-huh. Let's talk economics. A lot of Chinese sort of, belligerence comes from the fact that actually it has an economic hold over most of the other countries in the neighborhood. What is the economic relationship between Manila and Beijing?
Well, clearly, China gains more from our economic partnership than we are gaining from it. We export more from China than China. I mean, we import more from China than China imports from us. And clearly, what we have is a dependency on Chinese imports, and this is something that needs to be addressed. Because in terms of foreign direct investments, overseas development assistance, China does not really fare well in terms of the Philippine economy, and that's where Japan, the US, for example, play a much more significant role. But of course, the problem with a high dependence on imports is that you can't just redirect other sources for imports because that could lead to further inflation and socioeconomic costs. So I think the challenge here for the Philippines is to ensure that its partners are able to improve its manufacturing capabilities and, of course, enhance in more agreements and deals that may lessen its import dependence on China to a way that would not provoke the socio-economic fabric of the country. And this is a long-term strategy that requires a lot of continuity in policy processes. So hopefully we're setting the agenda right now for the years to come. But definitely the economic aspect is something that is continuously being addressed. And I think that President Marcos Jr. has always said that a major portion of the foreign policy is obviously to enhance the economic resilience of the country. So that goes hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I told you I would come back to the India part of it towards the end of the program. Dr. Jaishankar was there, and you were referring to his visit. What were your takeaways from that visit? What was different from this visit? What is your sense of that? Was there anything new that was promised? Was there something that reassured you? What are the practical expectations from India as far as Philippines is concerned?
Well, clearly, first of all, the change in public opinion in the Philippines when India was often considered traditionally to be a marginal player in Philippine dynamics or political decision making. Today, the dynamics of public opinion are very much supportive of a more robust collaboration between the Philippines and India. And of course, we can see here the visit also coincided with Coast Guard to Coast Guard exercises between the Philippine and Indian Coast Guards, right? And Dr. Jaishankar has also met a lot of his colleagues in the Philippines, along with his counterpart, Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo, the Defense Secretary of the Philippines, and also the National Security Advisor. So clearly, there was a major focus on security cooperation. And when Dr. Jaishankar met with President Marcos Jr., the momentum was actually solidified when the External Affairs Minister stated that you could definitely rely on India, to stand by you despite the challenges. And that in itself shows us that there is a lot of focus and a lot of attention surrounding the emerging Philippines-India security partnership. And of course, we've seen a lot of this coming up with the expected delivery of the BrahMos missiles. And India has, of course, expressed its willingness to take part in improving the defense and security capabilities of the Philippines, while also improving its capabilities for self-reliance. And this is, of course, in line with sharing of best practices with Atom Nirbhar Bharat, right? So this is, of course, very interesting, in a very interesting time where the relationship between both democracies of the Indo-Pacific are continuously on the rise, and I think that's
Mm.
that's very significant.
But were there any sort of, assurances that India would come to the Philippines' rescue if there was actually a chance of some kind of, military skirmish with China?
Well, there was a clear emphasis on the need to uphold the 2016 arbitral ruling, and recently, when Secretary Manalo was in India, Dr. Jaishankar reiterated the same position, which was a significant shift in India's policy towards Southeast Asia and the Philippines as well, and the South China Sea in general. But of course, we have to understand that India is also aware of, to what extent its engagements would be in Southeast Asia, because given the highly into the security dynamics between the Western Pacific, South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean region, India also makes sure that it doesn't seem that it is involving too much in the domestic affairs of its neighbors in Southeast Asia. But however, we are seeing that reciprocal momentum and that reciprocal momentum between both sides to really enhance security cooperation. So it's clear that India is willing to take part in the security journey of the Philippines, and that in itself is something that needs to be reflected, because it is highly significant for the bilateral partnership at this point in time.
Hmm. That's an interesting point that you made. But all these countries that we spoke of, Japan, Australia, the US, India, in geographical terms, they seem to be pretty far from the Philippines in that sense. By the time you actually sort of were, I mean, theoretically speaking, if you were to plan to send a force somewhere, it would take quite a while for something from Australia to reach the Philippines or from Japan to reach the Philippines. Among your nearer neighbors, has there been anybody else who said that, if you're there, look, we're also there with you?
Well, we
Let's
have
say
to understand
ASEAN.
that we have
What
a
is the ASEAN
we,
position on what you're doing?
Well, we have to understand that we have an enhanced defense cooperation agreement with the US, so which means that we have 9 bases that are on rotation here, which guarantees, of course, the presence of US troops. And we'll also be having an RAA, a reciprocal access agreement with Japan, and that would
Hmm.
also improve the momentum of Japanese troops, the speed and scope of Japanese troops in Philippine bases. So at that regard, there is that level of preparedness. And at the same time, of course, we are also engaged in a number of other activities in terms of maritime domain awareness and maritime exercises as far as geography is concerned. The U.S. state of Hawaii is also nearby. So
True.
where the Indo-Pacific Command is. So, as far as geography is concerned. But when we talk about Southeast Asian countries, I think that's not likely, given the history of Southeast Asia. ASEAN is not a security arrangement. It is an arrangement that took place during the Cold War period of 1990. 1967, due to the desire to survive amidst the fluctuating conditions of structure. So at that period between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and up to now, it's the U.S. and China. So it's unlikely to come across such statements from Southeast Asia. I think we are well aware of that in that reality.
Mhm. Okay. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I think we're running out of time, so let me close with last question. In your personal opinion, the South China Sea has become a very crowded place with a whole lot of, belligerents, for want of a better word, in the neighborhood, Chinese and the Americans and all the other navies that are involved. And now you have even the Europeans trying to get into the scene there. And people are increasingly worried about some kind of a, accidental thing escalating and spiraling out of control. How valid a fear is that?
Well, miscalculation remains very high in the South China Sea, especially with rising concerns of, as you've rightfully said, it's getting more and more crowded. And of course, at a time when we had the post-COVID-19 pandemic economic recovery and what's happening now in Ukraine, countries in Europe, for example, are in need of alternative sources of economic growth and development along with their demographic issues. So everyone's looking towards the east. And this is, of course, very important to note that increased engagements can eventually cause more chances for miscalculation. I think that's why it is necessary for all stakeholders involved to ensure transparency and engagement. But the problem is there are certain states like China that refuses to engage based on such rules and norms and institutions. And that's where the problem lies. And as it continues to provoke the situation, chances of miscalculation remains high. But of course, given the wariness of China and the Chinese military and escalating it to a certain extent that may cause a shooting war, and I think that's the sort of stop that it's trying to keep. But of course, as the situation continues to escalate, chances for miscommunication and miscalculation will inevitably be very high.
Well, that's a bit of a scary thought to sort of end this interview with, but I guess, and I hope that better sense prevails. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I do hope that whenever you're here in India next, I look forward to seeing you. I look forward to hosting you again. Thank you so much for taking time out for this. And like I said, I do hope
Thank
to
you
see
very
you
much.
once
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you. That was Professor Don McLain Gill, esteemed professor of geopolitical analyst and author and lecturer at the Department of International Studies at the De La Salle University in Manila, talking to us about the latest developments in that region, particularly the Philippines' pushback against Beijing's aggression. I do hope you enjoyed this edition of The Gist, and I look forward to seeing you again the next time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing off.